I'm curious, I guess, going right back to your fascination and your interest with the brain, where did that come from? And what age were you when you realized, oh, I want to be a scientist that studies the brain?
So there are two answers to that. As you'll notice, there are multiple answers to each of your questions. So I grew up in a family. My dad was first generation immigrant to the US. He is from Argentina. He came here on a naval scholarship to do physics. He's a physicist. So I grew up in a home where there were a couple very strong themes. And one of the themes was science and a life of inquiry just seemed to make him very happy. In fact, so that was one. And I'll mention a little bit more about that in a second. But the other was that, early on, I was exposed to conversations between graduate students and postdocs. In those days, they would come over to the house for dinner. We'd have barbecues. And I came to understand pretty early on that there was this group of people that we call scientists that get paid to figure things out and to pursue their curiosity. And I think that got embedded in me very young. Now, I didn't grow up in a house where people talked about sports, so I knew nothing about that, but I could tell you, who won the Nobel Prize. I knew a lot about some of the more interesting dynamics between scientists and their personal lives, just by eavesdropping on conversations between my parents. It was an interesting place to grow up. But basically, when I was about 6 years old, I remember this very well. My dad used to walk me to school about halfway, and then he'd let me go the remainder of the way on my own. And he would split off down this path, and he would go to his laboratory. He was a theoretical physicist at that time, working on some of the early foundations of chaos theory. And I remember asking him, I said, so, what do you do? We leave it, we part here every day. What do you do? And he said, well, I study how the natural world works, why things fall down, not up, why they, and I study things that are very, very small, smaller than either you or I could see, and how they work and how they make up everything, including you and me. And I was like, that's cool. I didn't really understand what that meant. I was 6. And I said, do you like it? And he said, well, that feeling when the next day is your birthday? I said, yeah, I absolutely know that feeling, 6 years old, right? And he said, well, I feel that way every day when I go to work. And I was like, wow. So I said, I want to do what you do. And he said, no, I don't think you want to do what I do, because by the time you're old enough to do that, a lot of the great puzzles of physics are going to be figured out. It's nice to get into a field of science early, and there aren't too many footprints on the beach. I remember him saying that. And I said, well, what should I do then? And he said, well, we don't know a lot about the brain. There are a lot of people that make up stories about how the brain works. This was in the, late 70s, right? He said, but we don't know a lot about the brain, but I think there's a lot to learn there. And I said, well, then I'll figure out how the brain works. So I declared that I was going to do that at age 6, but I had no idea what I was talking about, frankly. And it wasn't until much later. So to make a long story short, from, about 13 to 19, I was completely tuned away from school because of sort of like complex family life at home. And I was barely going to high school. I was obsessed with skateboarding and hanging out with my girlfriend at the time. And frankly, I was getting into trouble. I really left any kind of academic sentence, barely graduated high school, did manage to graduate, followed my girlfriend off to university. It's the only reason I went. Basically lived in the parking lot outside her dorm so I could be near her. She was kind of like my family at that point. And then a couple years later, joined the fire academy. I was interested in becoming a firefighter. I never went through the whole process. But then I sat in on a class at the university. This guy was a professor who was talking about thermal regulation and neurochemicals involved in depression and schizophrenia and hunger and feeding. I'm like, this is the coolest stuff ever. He was explaining to me how the world worked at a level that made sense. Had it been a class on quantum mechanics, it would have I think I would have been uninterested. Had it been something about sociology and how cultures migrate and interact, and that I probably would have been like, But there was something about the scale of inquiry, the kind of level of detail, and yet not so much detail that it was removed from reality, that I thought, this is amazing. I want to know more about it. So I went and told him, and he said, well, come work in my lab. So I worked in his lab. And then he said, you seem to have a knack for this stuff. And so eventually I enrolled and I started doing research. And at that point, I had to work very, very hard to become a scientist. I had huge gaps in my knowledge. By then I was about 19 years old. I had huge gaps in my knowledge base. I actually got a small studio apartment and was living alone. And I committed myself to just reading books, not just about math and science, but literature, just trying to take advantage of whatever brain plasticity was left at that age and, pack as much knowledge as I could, work in the laboratory. And that's pretty much all I did besides exercise, eat, and sleep. And I made the decision. I was going to become a scientist and, eventually went on to get my PhD, become a professor, eventually, got to Stanford, got tenure, just lot of work. It's been a lot of work. There've been some scars and scrapes along the way. It wasn't all easy, but I fell in love with this thing that we call the brain. And I decided, some people decide to join the military. Some people decide to become professional athletes. Some people become lawyers. I was like, sign me up. I want to be a brain explorer. So I think the seed was planted at age 6, but I didn't water that seed until much later.